So the day the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Jim Obergefell and his fellow plaintiffs in Obergefell versus Hodges, Supreme Court case which I'm sure you all know, Barack Obama said of the court's decision, "Today we can say in no uncertain terms that we've made our union a little more perfect." But what he said first on Twitter was "Love Wins," the title of the book that we're here for. In Love Wins, Obergefell teamed up with Washington Post investigative reporter Debbie Cenziper to tell the story both of Jim and his husband, John Arthur, and the story of the Supreme Court case that gave us marriage equality in all 50 states. This case is a civil rights landmark, and we're just amazed to have them here to talk about the fight for marriage equality, the celebration afterwards, and Jim's ongoing activism and why celebrating isn't enough. So, like I said, I hope you'll ask tons of questions during the Q&A, but first, Jim will read, they'll talk, and please join me to welcome them to Politics and Prose.
I'd like to read from the prologue. July 16th, 2013. Soon it would be time for goodbye. His husband was dying, and with the gentle knock on the bedroom door long past midnight, it would come now, quickly. But Jim Obergefell, married for 5 days, didn't want to think about a funeral, not on this bright July morning when Cincinnati was in the throes of summer and his husband John was sitting up in bed because the spasms that coursed from his hips to his toes had mercifully subsided. John Arthur couldn't wear a wedding ring. The weight of it hurt his fingers. He was naked under an electric blanket because clothing made his skin burn. His voice, what was left of it, had become winded and hoarse, a labored delivery of syllables and sounds that required great concentration and long, shallow breaths. Jim had to bend low to hear him, endlessly struck that a man who'd once had such a deep and lyrical laugh could now produce only a whisper. But for 5 days, John had pushed out a single perfect word. Husband. Good night, husband. Good morning, husband. I love you, husband. Disease had struck suddenly, just after John's 45th birthday 2 years earlier, when his left foot started dragging as if a 10-pound weight was bearing down on his shoe, and everything they knew shifted and splintered. The diagnosis of ALS had been a death sentence. The neurological disorder attacks the nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord, eventually robbing every muscle in the body of movement, including the diaphragm, which facilitates airflows to the lungs. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis literally suffocates its victims to death. Jim glanced at John in the bedroom they'd once shared, painted pale yellow and dominated by a hospital bed that compressed and expanded beneath John's weight. Jim had moved to the guest room, but already this morning he had spent several hours in a chair by John's bedside, watching the news on a television set loud enough to overcome the constant whoosh of an oxygen generator that pumped air through a line looping over John's ears and up into his nostrils. The bedroom faced east, and Jim had opened the window blinds so John could feel the sun. On this day, they were expecting a visitor. Jim was nervous about meeting a civil rights lawyer who had spent the better part of 30 years suing the city of Cincinnati. But when Al Gerhardstein rapped on the door of their downtown condominium just after 2 p.m., his smile was benign, and his graying sideburns were slightly disheveled, as if he had just come in from a run. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and when he shook Jim's hand, the embrace was firm and friendly. Al followed Jim down the length of the hall to the bedroom, where John was propped up on pillows, waiting. Dropping his briefcase to the floor, Al barely glanced at the hulking hospital bed. His younger sister, one of 6 Gerhardstein siblings, was paralyzed by multiple sclerosis, and on Saturday mornings, Al sipped coffee by her bedside until her caregiver arrived. He leaned forward and rested a light hand on John's shoulder, and then he said, "Tell me about your wedding." "Saying I thee wed was the most beautiful moment of my life," Jim said, looking at John, whose frail frame was hidden beneath the blanket, and remembering the lanky, grinning man with a mop of blonde hair. They had spent more than 20 years together in Cincinnati, spread across the hills and low ridges of the Ohio Valley, but had never felt compelled to marry because Ohio had banned same-sex marriage and the federal government didn't recognize the state-sanctioned marriages of gay couples anyway. But 3 weeks earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court had delivered an important win to the gay community, finding that same-sex couples married under state law deserved all the federal benefits that came with it, spanning health care, Social Security, veterans assistance, housing, taxes. So Jim and John had traveled to Maryland to marry, each mile in a private plane fixed with medical equipment wearing on John's fragile body. He suffered, Jim told Al. It's frustrating and hurtful to know that the person you love went through terrible pain and discomfort just to do something millions of others take for granted. I wanted us to be treated the same, John said slowly, each word a struggle, and I want Jim to be legally taken care of after I die. Al listened without taking notes. Once, 20 years earlier, when he had been in his early 40s, juggling 3 children and a shoestring law practice that operated on contingency, the voters of Cincinnati had changed the city's charter, permanently banning all laws that would protect the gay community from discrimination in areas like housing and employment. To Al, it was an arbitrary and hateful provision, and he sued in federal court. He spent nearly 5 years working without pay, and when the case was done, he questioned the city, the courts, and the application of law. He thought about shuttering his practice and taking up teaching, moving his family from Cincinnati. He wasn't sure if he would ever take on another major gay rights case, but then United States v. Windsor on June 26th had struck down a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act, which for more than 15 years defined marriage solely as a union between one man and one woman. The law, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote in the opinion overturning it, told gay couples that their otherwise valid marriages are unworthy of federal recognition. Over late nights in a dusty office overlooking a bus stop and the federal courthouse, a poster of Rosa Parks in the lobby, and hate mail tacked to a bulletin board in the kitchen, Al studied Ohio's ban on same-sex marriage, passed by a majority of voters in 2004. He discovered a striking inconsistency. Ohio prohibited first cousins and minors from marrying, but would recognize the marriages if they were performed in another state. The place of celebration rule came from a long-standing legal principle known as lex loci contractus, the Latin term for law of the place where the contract is made. But Ohio didn't apply that principle equally. Out-of-state marriages among same-sex couples were excluded. If the federal government after the Windsor decision had to recognize same-sex marriages on an equal basis with heterosexual marriages, Al thought, shouldn't states like Ohio have to recognize them too? The finding seemed entirely existential until a mutual friend told Al about John, Jim, and their marriage in Maryland. On a hunch, Al hurried to his filing cabinet and dug out a death certificate saved from an old lawsuit. He scanned the document from the Ohio Department of Health and immediately found what he was looking for. "This is it," he whispered, and 3 days later he went to meet John and Jim. When Jim got up for water, Al followed him into the dining room and pulled out the death certificate. "I'm sure you haven't thought about this, because who thinks about a death certificate when you've just gotten married?" Al pointed to Section 10, marital status. Al pointed to Section 11, surviving spouse. Jim had never studied a death certificate before, and he followed Al's fingers across the page. In Ohio, Al explained, their marriage did not exist. John would be classified as single when he died, and the box where Jim expected to be named as the surviving spouse would be left blank. In death, they would be strangers. "John's last official record as a person will be wrong," Al said gently. Jim's head started hurting as he thought about John, who had traveled nearly 500 miles to marry even though his bones ached and his skin burned. "I can't believe this," he said, wiping at tears with the back of his hand. "I just can't believe this." Across the country, lawyers and advocacy groups were focused on a broader mission, delivering same-sex marriage to all 50 states. But Al saw a narrow, tangible, and urgent need, one that had never been fully explored in an American courtroom. He asked Jim, "Do you want to talk about ways that you can fix this for you and John and make a difference for all gays here in Ohio?" Jim wasn't sure if there was room in their lives for a federal lawsuit, but he walked back down the hall and looked at John, whose wedding ring sat on a nightstand by the bed. There was no longer any question. Jim had no idea where the case might lead or how it would end, but with John's permission, Jim signed John's name and then his own to some papers that Al laid out in front of them. Alone in the fading light of the yellow bedroom, Jim and his husband launched the first ever challenge to Ohio's ban on the recognition of same-sex marriage, enshrined in the state's constitution by 3.3 million voters.
So this book got started 2 months before the Supreme Court even ruled on this case. I was working full-time as an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, but I actually knew Jim and his late husband John. They were at my first wedding 25 years ago, and so we had kept in touch off and on over the years. And like millions of other people, I read in the Washington Post about this case that seemed to be heading toward the Supreme Court. And I went right to my bosses at the Washington Post. I requested an unpaid leave of absence, and I started working on this because it just seemed like, it's an absolutely beautiful love story. And I called Jim and I said, would you trust me with this story? And he said yes, and we got started right away writing this book.
Yeah, it was quite the unexpected call. Over the couple of years of the case, people kept saying, Jim, you should write a book, you should write a book. But for me, I really couldn't seriously consider it for the first year or so after John died because I was still grieving. The thought of actually doing that was just too daunting. And then as I started to feel like I was healing and coming out of my grief, I got this phone call from Debbie saying, hey, I'm interested in writing a book. You want to do it with me? And it was just this great feeling of comfort because we did know each other. We had this history. And we decided right then and there, yeah, let's do it. And I think one of the best suggestions Debbie had right from the start was, Jim, let's not make this just about you and John. Let's expand this. Let's tell more stories, not just the two of you, but let's talk about some of the other plaintiffs. Let's talk about Al, your attorney, some of the other attorneys. And the other thing we did was make the decision to make Cincinnati really a character in the book as well, because Cincinnati has changed so dramatically over the past 20 years.
Yeah, one of the most compelling I think some of the most compelling characters in the book are these local scrappy civil rights lawyers like Al Gerhardstein, whose office faces a bus stop, and he's got faded green carpeting from the 1970s, and he's struggled for years just to keep the lights on, working on civil rights cases entirely on contingency. But he is a fascinating, really hero in this book. I mean, he grew up on a chicken farm outside of Cleveland. He got a full ride to NYU, and he could have gone anywhere, and he went back to Cincinnati to pursue civil rights cases. He's worked on, he's represented Planned Parenthood, he's represented inmates who have been hurt in prisons, and he's represented the gay community for years and years. And so he really emerges in this book, like the other small-town civil rights lawyers, as a real hero.
Yeah, and for me, of course, John's and my story is the one that means, that's so personal to me in this book. But I look at Al's story, and here's the story of this incredible man who fights for civil rights, and he's done it his entire career. And his story really is a redemption story, which you learn in the book. One of the very first things he did for gay rights was for his brother's partner. And that did in the 1980s, and that didn't end the way he wanted it to end. And then Al also fought the city of Cincinnati for this charter amendment that said no laws could be passed to protect the gay community in Cincinnati. And he applied or filed cert with the Supreme Court on that twice and never had a chance to go to the Supreme Court. They never heard the case. So for Al, this case, the marriage equality case, was a redemption story for him. And he's just this fascinating man who you have to love. I mean, it's funny. I've been told by quite a few attorneys, especially across the country, men and women, they're like, we have a crush on Al. And when you meet the man, it's hard not to, because he is just this wonderful, kind, gentle, but brilliant man. And I absolutely have to say, I think if it had been any other attorney who knocked on our door and met with us, I'm not sure John and I would have felt comfortable doing this. So I give Al huge amounts of credit for making it happen.
Yeah, one of the little known stories behind this case is that there were 4 states that took this case. Ohio was one of them that combined cases and went to the Supreme Court. That meant there were lots of lawyers involved, lots of local civil rights lawyers who really gave up everything because they weren't getting paid. In fact, one lawyer in Michigan had no money to hire expert witnesses, and she sold her family's home to fund this case. I mean, that's how committed these lawyers were. And interestingly enough, early on in this case, all of the lawyers in all 4 states were told by national advocacy groups, are you sure you want to bring this case? Is this the right case? Because they knew it was heading to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very conservative court. And they were a little bit nervous about it, and every lawyer stuck it out. Every lawyer, including Al, said, no, we have clients with a need, and we need to pursue this case. And eventually, all of the big national groups signed on and were just provided invaluable support for this case. But these lawyers stuck it out on their own very early on.
Yeah, Al talked a lot about how he did get that pushback, and he just always said, no, I'm sorry, I have clients with a need. They're being harmed. This is absolutely the right thing to do. It might not fit with this long-term strategy you have in place, but I have clients, and I fight for my clients. And I have to say, Al and every other attorney, once these 4 cases were consolidated, and there's, more than 20 attorneys, I think, total. They all, from day one, they kept us as the plaintiffs front and center. They always brought it back to us. And for me, I think about the day of oral arguments last April, year ago, April. At the very end of the 2.5-hour session, Douglas Howard Dreimeyer, who argued at the Supreme Court for the right to recognition of marriages, he ended the last minute of his presentation when he brought it back to John and me. He told our story again. He brought it back to us, and he just reiterated, it is about people who are real people in love, real people who are being harmed. And that was one of the great things about the experience with all of these attorneys. And then, Debbie, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the fun things you learned and uncovered, or it's the great access you got to a couple federal judges?
Yeah, well, as a reporter, I mean, getting a scoop is, of course, a big, huge deal. And I was lucky enough to reach out to 2 of the federal judges who ruled on this case, including Judge Tim Black in Cincinnati, who first ordered the state of Ohio to recognize the marriages of same-sex couples. And it's interesting, you had spouses in this case who were working to protect their spouses, but you also had parents in this case who were working to protect their children. And as a mother, that was really moving. What you had were same-sex couples who were legally married, but they had children or they adopted children in Ohio, and Ohio wouldn't recognize their marriages, which meant that on their children's birth certificates, only one mother or one father could be listed. They wouldn't list the names of 2 mothers or 2 fathers. And as a parent and a person, I just found that outrageous. It almost seemed punitive to me. And when Judge Black ruled in favor of these parents, he did so by citing a song, a John McClutchian folk song called "Oh Happy Adoption Day," kind of on the last page of his ruling. And Judge Black had adopted a daughter at birth with his wife, so this really meant something to him. And I was really happy to get those personal stories of judges in the book.
Yeah, and in fact, he held his decision on the birth certificate case until the anniversary day of his daughter's adoption. So it was very personal to him. And for me, I think back to, John and I got married on Thursday, July 11th. So actually today is 3 years ago today is our anniversary. And, we got married, we had no plans to do anything. We simply wanted to get married and live out John's remaining days as husband and husband. We had never thought of, never considered, never dreamt of filing a lawsuit. That was a Thursday, and that weekend our local newspaper did a story about us. And friends of ours were at a party on Saturday, and the story had come out online, and they ran into Al Gerhardstein, the civil rights attorney, a friend of theirs. And our story came up in conversation, and Al's mind started turning because he heard our story, and
At a cocktail party,
and he had already started working on ways to use the Windsor decision, which struck down part of the Defense of Marriage Act, to attack the Ohio law, constitutional amendment. So he actually ditched the party, didn't even tell his wife.
Left his wife there. Yeah.
But he asked our friends, do you think John and Jim might be willing to talk to me? So they got in touch, and John and I talked about it, and we said, sure. So we got married on Thursday. Tuesday, Al came to our home, so 5 days after we got married. And as in the prologue we talk about, he pulled out that death certificate. And as you can imagine, being told that the last official record of someone, the person you love, will be wrong, it's heartbreaking. I think more importantly, it made us mad. So that was Tuesday. We filed suit in federal district court on Friday. And on Monday, 11 days after we got married, I was in court for the very first hearing. And at 5 o'clock that day, Judge Black ruled in our favor. And John's favorite line in that decision was always the first sentence: "This is not a complicated case." And for us, that's what it always came down to. It's like, this is not complicated. We're Americans. We're supposed to be afforded the same rights and the same protections and the same responsibilities as any other American. So he just kicked off our decision with that. And then for the birth certificate case, doing it on the anniversary of his daughter's adoption and quoting that song, he really put a lot of heart into his decisions, into his thought process.
He has a lifetime appointment, so he was, not real worried. He was an Obama appointee, and he was, he really wanted to make a statement. But interestingly enough, at the first hearing that Jim is just describing, Al Gerhardstein went up against an assistant attorney general in Ohio named Bridget Kuntz, whose boss was Mike DeWine, and who had publicly stated he did not believe in same-sex marriage. And she was basically told at 4 o'clock on a Friday, 2.5 days before that hearing, that she would have to defend the state same-sex marriage ban in court. And this was a problem for Bridget because she personally supported same-sex marriage. So all weekend she's trying to figure out how she's going to go in and argue against the rights of this, loving, married gay couple when she had gay couples who were friends. And ultimately, she decided she needed to defend the law because that was her job and that was the state of the law, and that's what her boss decided. But for a brief moment, she wanted to go into court, put her hand up, and say, "Bridget Kuntz on behalf of the wrong side of this courtroom." And you knew that. You felt that.
I did. It was funny. After we walked out of the courtroom that day, and I forget who I said this to, but I said, you know what? I kind of get the feeling Mike DeWine decided this morning, last person in the office has to go down to Cincinnati and defend this. So it felt to me like
her heart wasn't in it.
Yeah, I picked up on something. So it felt like she drew the short straw. She was the last person in the office and just had to go do it. That was just the way that I felt. I don't know, it was weird. But another great thing that happened in that very first hearing, when we filed suit against the state of Ohio and the city of Cincinnati, because it's the Cincinnati Health Department that will the funeral director completes the death certificate, and then the health department in Cincinnati approves it, goes to the state. So we filed suit against the state and the city. And as I mentioned, back in 1993, the voters of Cincinnati passed that law that said no laws could be passed to protect the gay community. So fast forward to 2013, 20 years later, and in that very first hearing, the city solicitor for the city of Cincinnati stood up in court and said, "Your Honor, we agree with John and Jim. Their marriage deserves to be recognized." So in the span of 2 decades, we went from the city that was known as the town without pity to the city where our city solicitor stood up and said, "We're on their side. We don't want to be on the side of the courtroom with the state."
Yeah.
It was a pretty amazing change. And so much else has happened in Cincinnati that just has really done so much to protect the LGBTQ community. It's been an amazing change to see.
That's why we wanted to make Cincinnati such almost a character, a living, breathing character in this book, because we saw the change that Cincinnati, has really gone through over the last 2 decades is, something that the rest of the country is going through too. And by the time this case actually made it to the Supreme Court, every reputable poll, the Washington Post, CNN, found that 3/4 of Americans supported marriage equality and wanted this to happen, and still do. I mean, now we have 1 in 10 same-sex couples who are married a year later.
Yep. And so, as the case went along, it was our case and then the birth certificate case, which Al also had, and then we were consolidated with these 4 other cases from Tennessee, Michigan, and Kentucky. And it was a mix of right to marry cases and right to recognition. And we really became a family, all of the plaintiffs. I remember after we lost, when the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against us and we filed cert with the Supreme Court, I remember the day we were all waiting and hoping to hear from the Supreme Court if they accepted the case or not. We're all texting each other, we're all on Facebook, we're all on email, we're all on the internet, back and forth. Have you heard anything? Have you heard anything? And then the first person says, they just posted it, so we're all going to the internet and refreshing, and we became really a family. And it was this great experience of fighting with all of these other peoples. I wasn't the only widower. There was another widower in the case. You'll learn his story in the book. Our funeral director was part of the case, but then there were couples, there were parents, there were children. You'll learn a lot about Cooper, who was the youngest plaintiff at 2 years old. And we became this family over the course of this, and it was a really wonderful thing to experience. So we weren't doing this on our own, which was really nice.
For me, I was an outsider, of course, looking in, and what I was so moved by was that these were ordinary people. These were not activists. They weren't people who had ever planned on changing the law of the land. They never planned on being inside the halls of the Supreme Court. They were regular people, and they stepped forward to protect the people they loved most in this world. And as a human being and as a journalist, I was really, really moved by that. And I think what I saw the day of the Supreme Court decision a year ago was not just joy and happiness, but it was a sense of empowerment for people. I mean, I think it was, my God, look what we just did.
Yep.
And so many millions of people celebrated with you and are still celebrating with you.
I mean, I have to say that day, June 26th last year, sitting in the courtroom, because I was there for oral arguments. Mid-June, I started being in the courtroom for every decision day because we really didn't know when it would come out. And the morning of June 26th, I got to the courthouse really early like I typically did, and I was in the public line every time I was there, and they would hand out tickets. And that morning, June 26th, they handed out the tickets, and we're all chatting, and I looked down at the ticket, and I realized something had changed. Every other time we'd been in line, the ticket, and this was for oral arguments as well as decision days, the tickets were bright orange. The morning of June 26th, I looked down and realized it wasn't orange that day. It was lavender. So we thought, this could be a hint. And the fact that it was June 26th as well, most of us at the court that day, we already were there feeling positive because June 26th, it was the same day as the Lawrence versus Texas decision and the Windsor decision. So we already thought this has to be a message of some sort. And then to see this lavender ticket. And I have to tell you, being in the courtroom when Justice Kennedy read his summary decision, other than my very first reaction thinking, God, I wish John were here, I just want to hug him and kiss him and say, guess what, baby, we won. The other reaction I had, the feeling that I had, which took me by surprise, I realized for the first time in my out gay adult life, I felt more like an equal American than I ever had. And it was this beautiful feeling and realization that I felt that way. And that's what the Supreme Court's all about. It's about protecting our rights. And it was such an amazing experience to be in that courtroom and to hear that, and then to walk out into the crowd on the plaza. It was just an absolutely beautiful day.
At the time, there was such amazing support for the gay community, and still is, but there's definitely now, as we all know, been a backlash after Orlando and with bathroom laws and religious exemption laws. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah, we did expect backlash, but I know I'm surprised that it's been as vicious as it has been, and especially how it's targeted, especially the most vulnerable community, our transgender siblings. These bathroom bills, everything that's been coming out, it's been frankly disgusting and frightening. But I cling to a couple things. I cling to an experience I had on oral arguments day. I'm sitting out in the courtroom with Aunt Paulette. So John's aunt who married us, she was with me in the courtroom for oral arguments. And the other plaintiffs were sitting in a different part of the courtroom because they could only be there for part of the 2.5-hour session. I was there for the full 2.5 hours. And the people around us, once they realized who I was, the gentleman sitting right next to me said, Jim, I have to tell you, your story really touched someone deeply today. I have a twin brother who's a Roman Catholic priest. And he called me this morning and said, Rob, I know you're going to the courtroom this morning. I had to tell you, I read the story about the named plaintiff, and it really affected me, really touched me deeply. A few minutes later, Rob is saying that same thing to Aunt Paulette. She's sitting on my right, Rob's on my left. But this time he says, John and Jim's story really affected two people today. I thought, well, you told me about about your brother, who's the other person? And then he turns to me and says, and Jim, I'm an evangelical Republican. He shook my hand and thanked me. So that was one of those moments where I thought, you know what? This case, John's and my story, it does resonate with people. Everyone loves someone, everyone loses someone they love. And telling stories is how you change hearts and minds. And I thought, here I am being told this by someone I would have never expected to be on my side. And he is. So it was that realization that stories do really make a difference, and that's how we change the world. So that was one thing. That's one thing I cling to, is knowing that if we keep telling stories, things will get better. The other thing I cling to is just knowing that the younger generation, they don't understand what the big deal is. Parents tell me all the time, I have a kid who's 8, 10, 12, whatever, and when this comes up in conversation, their reaction is always, why? What's the big deal? Of course they deserve marriage equality. Of course they deserve to be treated equally and have those same protections. So for me, even with the backlash, I cling to those things because that gives me hope. And we are moving in the right direction. Fortunately, I think we can say that with every advance in this country, there's oftentimes a step or two back in reaction, but I am hopeful, and that's what I cling to. Our younger generation and the fact that stories do change hearts and minds. I've lived it. I've experienced it.
Two questions.
Yeah, so I think we'll open it up to questions now. We've talked a lot here, so anything you want to ask. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Diego. First of all, thank you for giving me a nice study break from studying for the bar, the best way possible. So obviously you've written down your story with this book, and people can read it, from now on. But years from now, law students will be reading Obergefell the same way that they read Lawrence and Gideon and all the other and Miranda and all these other cases where you focus more on the law, and people will be focusing on the way that Justice Kennedy decided this case, but you'll kind of forget the story. And law students, you'll just speed through the facts and you kind of get the picture. What is it that you want those law students to remember and to learn from this case and your story?
For me, great question, Diego. Thank you. I've met a lot of law students over the past year and a half, and I have to tell you that every single time I meet one and talk to one, what they say is, you know what? Thank you for reminding us that at the heart of every case, no matter how arcane the legal aspect of it might be or the writing, it always comes down to the fact that there are real people at the heart of it. And I hope that's what any law student studying this case, or really any other case, always remembers, that this isn't just some abstract back and forth legal writing. This is about real people. And that's what the law is there to protect. The law is there to protect people and to ensure that they're treated equally and fairly. So I hear it from law students over and over, and if every student who reads about this and the Windsor case, any other case, if they just remember that it's about real people, then that's the most important thing.
Thank you.
I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now and hope to do the next several years. And also, during this process of the court litigation, it seems you must have met with various political people, both in Ohio and elsewhere. Could you share some of the substance of those meetings and whether you ever had any discussion about this with the governor? Because whether one agrees or disagrees with his view, he seems to be about the only adult in the Republican primary,
Yeah.
I disagreed, it's over, let's move on. So whatever you could share about that and you're doing now would be very interesting.
Thank you. Great question. It kills me to say, yes, John Kasich was the only one of those candidates who said, this has been decided, let's move on, it's law. Because, honestly, I didn't want to say anything good about John Kasich. As my governor, he fought this tooth and nail. He made sure Mike DeWine fought it tooth and nail. And having lived in Ohio with him as my governor for several years now, I'm not incredibly pleased with the way Ohio is under his leadership. So it killed me to say anything positive about him. But at least I could say it. I've not met him. I've not met Mike DeWine. I've met quite a few politicians. They all tend to be from one side of the aisle. And that's been a really positive experience for me. You know, I got to be on the floor of the Senate when Senators Cory Booker and Sherrod Brown spoke in support of marriage equality and LGBTQ rights in general. So that was a great experience to be in that chamber and to be there when they spoke for that to be on the record. But yeah, I mean, I've met a lot of politicians, but honestly, it hasn't been so much around discussing policy or anything. It's been a little bit more in the kind of social aspect of things. What am I doing now? Well, my life is completely different. Actually in December of 2014, I got my real estate license. And I haven't done a thing with real estate in over a year now. I was never an activist. John and I were never activists whatsoever. But going through this experience and fighting for John and fighting for couples like us across the country made me realize I need to be involved in fighting for something bigger than I am, something more important than I am. So I've continued to work with Quality Ohio, Quality Florida, the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign. I've been on Capitol Hill lobbying for the Equality Act, which if you don't know the Equality Act, that would update the 1964 Civil Rights law to include gender identity and sexual orientation. So I've been getting much more politically involved. Worked on this book for quite a while. Do a lot of speaking engagements. And we also sold the movie rights to the book. So spent some time back in May, I think it was, in Cincinnati with the screenwriter. So he's at work on the screenplay. So that'll start taking, I think, a little bit more of my time as well coming up before long. But I've also gotten a little more involved with working towards addressing LGBTQ youth homelessness with a couple programs in the greater Cincinnati area. So I like being involved. I have to keep fighting. I know that's going to be what I do for the rest of my life as much as I can.
Who do you want to portray you in the movie?
I have to tell you, I get that question all the time, and it's such an odd thing to think about. So all I will say is Shallow Jim comes out, and I think, well, if I'm going to be on a big movie screen, someone portraying me, I want to be hot. So Matt Bomer from White Collar, Magic Mike, if you don't know who he is. And he's also gay, which I love. It would be great to, have a gay actor. But for me, that isn't important. What's important is when they cast the movie, they cast actors who bring the most heart and soul and bring the characters to life. That's what's most important.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hi, Marty Wasserman. To thank you, Jim, and Debbie for really sharing the story and bringing the story to life. And I felt in my heart, to have it be today, to be the third wedding anniversary, and for John not to be here, a certain mixed feelings that you must have today. But on a personal note, as a parent of a gay son who lives in North Carolina, he and his partner 4 months after your wedding also came to Maryland, and they were married here. And so on the day that the Supreme Court decision came out, it was real joy in our family. So I wanted to thank you for that. And the only question that I have is the concern about the Sixth Circuit and getting the story, the personal story that you got that sounded like this was almost a slam dunk. So what was the Sixth Circuit, or who was in the Sixth Circuit that was supposed to be the evil doer there?
Well, there was the Sixth Circuit is one of the more conservative circuits in the country, and there was a 3-judge panel who had been assigned this case, and 2 of the judges were Republican appointments onto the bench, and one was a Democrat. And Ultimately it was a 2-to-1 vote against marriage equality, but the judge who dissented, Martha Daughtry, who was the Democrat, actually opened up to tell her story in this book. She's, besides Jim and Al, my favorite character in the book, because she was one of the only female law students at Vanderbilt, years and years ago. She's always been a first, first judge, first female judge here, first female judge here, first lawyer, and first female lawyer. And she compared this movement to the women's movement and women's right to vote. And she described what it was like in the robing room right after oral arguments in court. She came out, she took off her black robe, she sat down and faced these other 2 male judges and said, come on guys, these 2 men were in love, and she ultimately lost the case.
Yeah, and the Sixth Circuit, and as well as at the Supreme Court, the arguments against were always, well, let's just wait and see. Attitudes are changing. Let's just let that happen. Or, democratic process. And, I always go back to what Al said in our very first hearing when the democratic process came up. And his reply was, the surest way to abridge the rights of a minority group is to allow the majority to vote on it. And just kept coming back to that. So, the states kept arguing, let's just let time take care of it. And our attorneys just kept coming back to that and saying, no, our clients, they brought it back to us again, our plaintiffs don't have time. That's not a fair or accurate or valid tack to take, because that's not right for our clients. So it was great. And I have to say, Marty, congratulations on your son's marriage, and thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for putting your love story out there.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Russ. So I want to come back to your point about narrative and storytelling, which I think is really central both to this case and to the broader political success also of the LGBTQ community in the last decades. And it's important on its own, but I also, after this past week, where I am feeling, I suspect many of us are feeling just brutalized by the news in the past week, and constant reminders that other ongoing civil rights struggles are still very much in play, and whether they are solved through the courts, through culture, through politics. I wonder, having gone through the experience you've gone through, what advice you have to others in other movements about how to use familiarity and sort of personal narrative to help bridge gaps in American society more broadly.
It really comes down to education and sharing stories. I'll say a couple things about that. After the decision, I was in Nashville, I think it was, and having lunch, and it was I just happened to be sitting to some guy I didn't know, and a stranger, and somehow marriage equality came up, and he said, well, so you've won marriage equality, and you're done now, right? And I had to educate him that no, even though we can now get married in too many places across the country, a couple who exercises that constitutional right can then lose their jobs, they can lose their homes. So it comes down to education, and we have to educate our fellow Americans. So we educate them about facts, but we also have to tell our stories. I think about Harvey Milk. He said, come out, share your stories, because that's how we change hearts and minds. And I know for me, I share a little bit about the gentleman next to me in the Supreme Court room. I also had people in my life, a friend I've had since 1989, said, Jim, knowing you, having met John, having known you as a couple, and then watching you fight for your marriage and fight for John, she said, you changed my opinion on marriage equality. And I had another friend tell me the same thing. So that's the power that we all have. We have the power to share our stories and to have an impact on people. Beyond that, that isn't going to solve everything, but I think for every group that's still fighting for dignity and for equality, you're right. It's been a very painful several weeks, month or so here, and we have to tell our stories because that's the only way we can change people's minds. Fortunately, it takes time, but to me, that's really the best way to do it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Ross.
Hi. So thank you both for being here and speaking. I guess my sort of bigger question is just about the ways that, and granted, I haven't read the book as yet, but the ways that it does and does not address the queer community as it exists beyond white gay men. Certainly, there are many of us who don't identify as such, and it's a spectrum that we exist on. So, as far as marriage equality goes, that was huge, and it holds such historical significance for us. But when a decision like this might only benefit a certain portion of the LGBTQ plus community, I wonder about what's left to be done. And you did kind of just touch on education and how crucial that is. But I'm wondering if either of you have any opinions on that.
Well, I think it comes down to those of us within the community, no matter what part of that community we identify with, it comes down to our allies also speaking up, reaching out, telling their elected officials what's important and what should be done to protect their community, the community they care about, the people they love. And big thing we all have to do is vote, and we have to remember the people who are out there proposing and voting on laws to deny us rights and to deny any part of our nation's citizenry, whatever that is, the LGBTQ plus community, immigrants, women, African Americans, etc. We have to remember the politicians and the government officials who don't believe in equality for all Americans, and we have to remember that when we go to the ballot box. That is our greatest power. In addition to telling stories, we have to vote. We have to remember who deserves to be voted out, and we have to make sure we do that, and we have to talk to people about that. So for me, that's what it comes down to, and that's still education. You have to be educated when you vote, and you have to vote. I mean, if we don't vote, we can't complain about what happens. So for me, that's I think the strongest, the most important thing that we can do is vote.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for your courage to go through with this. Probably one of the highlights of my life was a couple of weeks ago. I went to Texas, and two of my very best friends in the whole wide world that have been together 40 years got married in Texas, Houston, Texas. And I'll have to say that it was the best wedding I've ever been to, including the two of mine that I went to. Now I'm not married, so that tells you about when you love someone. Your story was just so great, but I can't wait to read it. But did you have contingency plans? Like, I mean, you had a good outcome, but what did you think about? What if?
I tried not to, and I have to say, John really, he had a great effect on me in a lot of ways, and one of the best ways he helped me understand and put into practice not obsessing about things I can't control, and always having the glass half full attitude. And I had to do that during this process. I wouldn't let myself consider the possibility that they would rule against us. It was too scary. It was too painful to consider that. So for me, contingency was, I'm just not going to think about it, and I'll deal with it when it happens. But from like the legal aspect of it, for me personally, when John was diagnosed with ALS, we did everything we could to prepare ourselves. We bought a new condo, one that was one level, much more handicap friendly. And when we decided to do that, John said, and Jim, my name is not going on it. This will only be in your name. Mm-hmm. So he was thinking ahead, what can we do to make sure that no matter what happens, you're protected, you don't find yourself in a really bad situation. So it amazes me that I can say one good thing about ALS, and that is ALS, you have limited time. But that's enough time to do all of those legal things, financial things, that if he had died in a car accident or dropped dead of a heart attack, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So for me, from the very personal kind of legal and financial perspective, for me, I didn't have to have a plan B because we had taken care of all of that. It was more the fear of if we had lost, wondering how soon after we lost I would get an updated death certificate in the mailbox from the state of Ohio, because I absolutely believed that they would do that just to be vindictive.
Yeah, in fact, Jim was, I talked to him throughout this case, throughout the time, and he was very calm and level-headed, but some of the parents in the case were not quite as calm because they had received birth certificates from the state of Ohio with an asterisk on the bottom that said pending the outcome of this court case. I mean, so even when they won in federal court in Ohio still sent them death certificates with birth certificates with an asterisk on the bottom. And so, you know, they're thinking about it from their kids' perspective, and you know, a couple of them, I think, ran to legally adopt in certain places just to do everything they could to protect their kids before the outcome of this case.
I'll just make one more comment. I have a straight girl affection for Matt Bomer and Jonathan Groff, but Jim, I think you're hotter than both of those guys. And not to discount your love and your relationship with John, but I hope that you find love again.
Thank you. And I will tell you that's, you know, Facebook, of course, so I had to post something today about it being our 3-year anniversary, and part of that was, again, thanking John. He gave me so much, but one of the most selfless things he gave me was over the last year of his life, over and over, he would tell me this. He would tell people who came to visit, and they would kick me out for like an hour or two so I could take a break. He would tell them and tell them to tell me as well, but he told me over and over, when I'm gone, Jim, don't give up. Keep living, keep loving, find happiness again. And that's a really beautiful gift to get from someone. And I figure, you know, this case was all about living up to my promises and commitments to John. So I figure the least I can do is live up to that promise as well.
Right.
So
Great. Well,
that's what I'm doing.
Best of luck
Thank
to you
you.
and everything else that you do in your life. You've already, I mean, you've attained it, so.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.